She reached for the old man's receipt, and the man behind him stopped smiling. Margaret Ellis stood at the grocery counter with a paper bag in one hand and a folded receipt in the other, the fluorescent lights above her buzzing softly against the smell of warm bread, oranges, and floor wax. The cashier had already slid her card back with a polite nod, but the gentleman waiting behind her had noticed what nobody else had: the way she hesitated before placing the last few bills on the counter, as if counting them one more time might make them stretch farther. The old man in front of her, dressed in a faded tan coat that had gone soft at the elbows, looked down at his basket of basics: milk, bread, eggs, soup, and a single apple, then back at Margaret when she stepped forward. He had weathered hands and a careful voice, the kind that never asked for help even when he needed it. "Ma'am," he said, glancing at the register screen, "you don't have to do that." Margaret kept her purse tucked close to her side. "I know," she replied, her fingers already reaching for her debit card again. "But you're short." It was said simply, without performance, without waiting for anyone to notice. Behind them, a few shoppers shifted their carts, the plastic wheels squeaking over the tile. Somewhere near the deli, a slicer whirred, and the cold air from the open refrigerator doors brushed past her wrists. The old man's mouth tightened in a way that suggested he was used to refusing kindness before it could embarrass him. He lowered his voice. "You don't know me." Margaret's answer came instantly, steady as if she had already decided long before she ever reached this checkout line. "You looked like you needed help." Those 6 words changed the air around the register. The cashier paused with one hand on the scanner, and even the woman in line behind them stopped checking her phone. The old man stared at Margaret a second longer than was comfortable, studying the plain wool coat on her shoulders, the scuffed toe of her shoe, the careful way she kept her hands from trembling as she counted the remaining change in her palm. Then, with a quiet exhale, he let her pay. The receipt printed with a dry crackle and curled against the counter. Margaret tucked it into her purse and lifted the bag of groceries with both hands, unaware that the old man was still watching her with an expression that did not belong to an ordinary shopper. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and touched a sleek black phone that had never once been visible at the register. Across the store, by the front windows, a tall man in a charcoal suit stood motionless near the entrance, one hand in his pocket, the other resting against the cart handle as if he owned the entire aisle. He had not said a word, yet the employees near the doors seemed to straighten without knowing why. The old man finally turned his head and gave the man a small nod. The stranger's jaw tightened once, almost imperceptibly, and his dark eyes followed Margaret as she lifted the bag and started toward the exit. She never looked back, but the old man did. And when the man by the door stepped forward into the light, the expensive fabric of his suit catching the pale reflection from the freezer cases, it became clear that this was not just any grandson waiting in silence. Margaret had barely reached the glass doors when the old man's voice stopped her. "Miss Hayes." It was quiet, but in the polished silence of the grocery store, it carried like a hammer strike. She turned with the plastic bag hanging from her wrist, the paper receipt folded in her fingers, and saw him standing beside the cart corral under the cold white lights. Up close, he looked smaller than he had at the register, but there was nothing fragile in the way he stood. His wool coat smelled faintly of cedar and rain, and his shoes, old but carefully shined, tapped once against the tile as he stepped closer. Behind him, the tall man in the charcoal suit had moved just inside the entrance, where the automatic doors exhaled a burst of chilled air every time they opened, and the store employees suddenly found reasons to stare at the card readers, the floor, anywhere but at the two of them. The old man held out his hand, palm up. "You paid for my groceries," he said. "Now you're going to let me return the favor." Margaret hesitated, the plastic handles cutting into her fingers. "Sir, that's not necessary." "It is," he replied, and there was a hard line under the gentleness in his voice. "You did something decent when you thought no one important was watching. That matters." He reached into his coat and removed a slim leather wallet worn smooth at the edges. Margaret saw a silver card glint between his fingers before he closed the wallet again. "My name is Arthur Vale," he said, "and the man by the door is my grandson." The tall man did not move, but the room seemed to shift around him anyway. Margaret looked from the old man to the younger one, taking in the expensive suit, the watch catching light at the cuff, the quiet authority in the set of his shoulders. Arthur continued, his voice steady as the hum of the freezer units. He owns this store. The words landed softly, but they changed the air. A bagger near aisle 6 froze with a stack of oranges in his hands. Somewhere in the back, a cart rattled over a seam in the tile and then went still. Margaret's mouth parted. Owns. Among other things, Arthur said. And he heard every word that was said to you at the counter. The younger man finally stepped forward, the polished soles of his shoes making no sound on the waxed floor. He stopped under the hanging fluorescent fixture, and the light carved a bright edge along his jaw. My name is Julian Vale, he said. His voice was low, even, controlled enough to make the air feel tighter around it. And my grandfather is correct. Margaret tightened her grip on the bag. I didn't do it for attention. I know, Julian said at once. That's exactly why I'm speaking to you. He glanced toward the register where the cashier had gone pale, then back to Margaret. You should not have been made to feel small in this store. Arthur gave a single dry nod, as if that settled a matter he had already decided. Julian reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and removed a black credit card, so dark it seemed to drink the light. He held it out, not to impress her, but to make a point. You're coming with us, he said. Margaret took a slow breath. The refrigerated air brushed her cheeks, carrying the smell of citrus peel and floor cleaner, while the automatic doors sighed open behind her and then shut again. I already paid for the groceries. Then let me pay for your time, Julian said, and for the disrespect you were shown. Arthur's eyes stayed on her face, sharp and measuring. Then he looked at Julian and gave one small, deliberate nod. Julian's hand remained extended. There's a better conversation waiting in my car, he said, and I think you should hear it. Julian guided her toward the black sedan waiting beneath the store's striped awning, its windows tinted so dark they reflected the fluorescent lights like sheets of oil. The parking lot shimmered with late afternoon heat, and the cart wheels rattled over cracked pavement as a cashier stared from the entrance, frozen with a half-finished cigarette at her lips. Margaret kept one hand tight around the paper grocery bag still resting against her ribs, the brown paper warm from the canned soup inside. You don't have to do this, she said, as the driver opened the rear door. Yes, Julian answered, steady and low, I do. Arthur moved around to the other side without a word, his cane tapping once against the asphalt before the sound vanished into the hum of idling engines. Inside the car, the air was cold enough to raise goosebumps on Margaret's forearms, and the leather seat gave a soft sigh when she sat down, careful not to wrinkle her coat any more than it already was. Julian closed the door himself, then stepped around to the opposite side and slid in beside her. For a moment, none of them spoke. The sedan pulled away from the curb, gliding past a row of shopping carts and a flickering neon sign, while the city moved by in sun-faded brick, dented mailboxes, and windshields flashing like mirrors. Finally, Margaret set the envelope of receipt copies in her lap and looked at Julian's hand resting near his knee. The veins on the back of it were visible even in the dim light, and the ring on his finger caught a brief pulse from the street outside. Why are you helping me? She asked. Julian's eyes stayed on the road ahead as the driver merged into traffic. Because you paid for my grandfather's groceries, he said. And because no one who can do that should ever be made to feel small. Arthur gave a short, dry sound that might have been a laugh, then turned his gaze to Margaret. He doesn't say things like that often, he said. You should know it costs him something. Margaret glanced between them, then back out the window as they passed a row of storefronts where the last sunlight lay across the glass in long gold bars. When the sedan slowed at a red light, Julian reached into the pocket of the door and removed a folded cream-colored card. He didn't hand it to her immediately. Instead, he held it between two fingers, letting her read the name embossed in clean black letters. This is my office number, he said. Tomorrow morning, you call it. Margaret hesitated, the paper bag crackling softly against her coat. What for? Julian's jaw tightened just enough to show it. To tell me why you were in that aisle counting coupons like the whole world depended on those groceries. Arthur looked out his window, the city reflected in the glass, then said, and to tell him what happened before I arrived. The light changed. The sedan moved forward. Margaret closed her fingers around the card, and Julian's expression shifted by a fraction, as if he had already decided something he hadn't said out loud. There's one more thing, he said, his voice even, controlled, impossible to read. The driver slowed again, this time not for traffic, but for the gates rising ahead of them, wrought iron glinting beneath a security lamp. Margaret turned toward the front windshield and saw a long private drive curving up toward a house that seemed to emerge from the trees like a shadow built of stone and money. Julian rested one hand on the armrest, his thumb tapping once, twice, against the leather. "Before we talk about your groceries," he said, "I want to know why you were buying them alone." The sedan rolled through the iron gates and onto a drive lined with trimmed hedges slick from the evening mist. Gravel snapped under the tires. Beyond the windshield, the house rose in layers of gray stone and warm amber windows, every pane glowing against the dark like a held breath. Margaret kept her hands folded around her purse, the grocery receipt still tucked inside her palm, while Julian sat beside her in silence, his suit sharp against the leather seat and his attention fixed on the old paper sack at her feet. When the car stopped, a uniformed attendant opened the door, and the cool air outside carried the scent of wet cedar and polished stone. Margaret stepped out slowly, her shoes brushing the wet gravel, and followed Julian toward the front steps. The double doors opened before they reached them. Inside, the foyer was vast and hushed, lit by a chandelier that scattered gold across marble floors and the dark wood of a sweeping staircase. At the far end of the room, an old man stood with one hand braced on a cane, his gray sweater neat, his shoulders narrow, his face lined with the kind of weather that only comes from many hard years. He looked at the grocery bag in Margaret's hand first, then at her, then at Julian. "You found her," he said, his voice dry and worn, but not surprised. Margaret blinked once. Julian took the bag from her gently and set it on a console table. "I did," he said. The old man's eyes shifted to Margaret's face, and he gave a small nod that seemed to carry more weight than any greeting. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, "thank you for feeding an old fool when no one else was watching." Margaret's fingers tightened around her purse strap. "It was only groceries," she said, though the words sounded too small in a room like this. The old man gave a faint, crooked smile and reached into the inside pocket of his sweater. Not a wallet, but a folded bank envelope, thick and crisp. He did not hand it to her yet. Instead, he looked to Julian. "Tell her," he said. Julian's jaw shifted once. The leather of his gloves creaked as he took them off and laid them on the console table beside the groceries. Then he turned back to Margaret, and in the silence, the chandelier glass gave a soft, cooling tick. "The man you bought for," he said carefully, "is my grandfather." Margaret's mouth parted, but before she could answer, the old man lifted a hand. "And before you say you did too much," he said, "understand this. For 2 weeks, I watched people step around me like I was part of the floor. You were the only one who treated me like I still mattered." Julian reached for the envelope at last, but instead of opening it, he placed it flat in Margaret's hand and closed her fingers over it. "My grandfather doesn't forget kindness," he said. "Neither do I." Margaret looked from one face to the other, from the old man's steady gaze to Julian's unreadable calm, and then down at the envelope. It was heavier than it should have been. She could hear the faint hiss of the foyer fountain, the distant click of a clock somewhere deeper in the house, the soft whisper of rain against the tall windows. Julian's phone buzzed once in his pocket. He ignored it. The old man stepped closer, cane tapping once against marble. "Open it," he said. Margaret drew the flap back with 2 careful fingers. Inside was not cash. It was a key card with a black stripe, a handwritten note, and beneath it, a set of documents stamped with a seal she didn't recognize. Julian watched her face as she read the first line, and for the first time since the bank, the room seemed to narrow around them. "That card," he said quietly, "is for a house that belongs to you now." Margaret's fingers tightened around the key card as if the black plastic might burn through her skin. The foyer light spilled gold across the glossy marble, catching the rainwater still beating on Julian's dark coat and the polished brass handle of the envelope in her hand. The handwritten note inside was short enough to fit on a single line, but the words seemed to press against the room. Julian took one slow step back and nodded toward the hallway beyond the staircase. "The house is yours for the year," he said. "My grandfather insisted on it." The old man gave a small tap of his cane against the floor, the sound crisp and dry in the hush. "And before you argue, Mrs. Hayes, the deed is already filed." Margaret looked up from the documents, then down at the key card again. then at the two men waiting in silence. The air smelled faintly of cedar polish and rain-damp wool, and somewhere near the kitchen a clock kept its steady, measured beat. "I don't understand," she said, her voice thin but level. "Why would you do this?" Julian's jaw shifted once. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded sheet of paper with a bank letterhead, then held it out without stepping closer. "Because you paid for my grandfather's groceries when everyone else in that store looked through him like he was invisible." Margaret did not take the paper right away. Her eyes moved to the old man's expensive cane, the sharp cuffs of Julian's shirt, the neat line of his collar, the kind of posture men had when they were used to rooms opening for them. "That was a grocery cart," she said. "Not a miracle." The old man's mouth twitched at that, almost a smile. Julian, however, did not. He looked past her shoulder toward the front window, where the rain turned the garden into a blur of silver stems and dark glass. "To you, maybe," he said. To him, it was the first time in a long while someone treated him like a man instead of a burden. Margaret lowered the key card to the envelope and finally took the paper. It was a property transfer, cleanly typed, signed, and stamped. No charity language. No donation clause. Just a house, a utility account, and her name in full black ink. Her thumb traced the edge of the page. The paper was still warm from Julian's hand. "I can't accept this," she said, though her hand never let go. "Yes," the old man said softly, "you can." He leaned on his cane and looked at her with the same steady gaze he'd worn in the grocery store aisle. "Because you did not help me expecting anything. That is rare enough to deserve respect." Julian's phone buzzed again. This time he answered it, his expression flattening into something colder. He listened for only a few seconds before slipping the phone back into his pocket. Then he turned to Margaret, and the room seemed to lose another degree of warmth. "There's something else," he said. The old man's fingers tightened once on the cane. Margaret saw it immediately, the slight shift in Julian's posture, the way the house itself seemed to hold its breath around him. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and withdrew a second card, heavier than the first, edged in black and gold. "Tonight," he said, placing it on top of the documents. "You're coming with us." Margaret stared at the card, then at his face. Outside, thunder rolled low over the roofline, and the glass panes shivered with the sound. Julian's voice dropped, quiet and absolute. "If you want to understand why my grandfather chose you, you need to see what happens when the rest of my world finds out who you are." The thunder had barely faded when Julian's driver opened the rear door of the black sedan parked at the curb, and Margaret stood on the steps with her raincoat pulled tight around her shoulders, the cold air carrying the sharp smell of wet asphalt and diesel. The old man's cane tapped once against the stone behind her, but Julian was already reaching for the grocery bags she had carried all the way from the market, taking them with a careful grip as if they contained something far more fragile than peaches and bread. "You don't have to keep helping me," Margaret said, glancing at the line of tinted windows and the two men standing by the car in dark suits, their earpieces glinting under the street lamp. Julian's mouth barely moved. "Tonight, you're not helping anyone. You're coming with me." He set the bags inside, then opened the door for her himself. The leather seat gave softly beneath her weight, and the car's interior smelled faintly of cedar, polished wood, and expensive cologne. For a moment, all Margaret could hear was the steady hum of the engine and the rain ticking against the roof. Then Julian slid in beside her, and the door shut with a heavy, final sound. The ride moved through the city in near silence, streetlights washing across the windows in gold and blue flashes. Margaret kept her hands folded in her lap, her worn purse pressed against her coat, while Julian spoke into his phone in a low voice she couldn't fully catch. A few words reached her anyway: security, arrival, front entrance. Every so often, he glanced at her hands, then at the silver crucifix at her throat, as if measuring something she couldn't name. When the car turned off the main avenue, the buildings changed. The small storefronts and shuttered diners gave way to glass towers rising out of the dark like black mirrors, their windows lit from within by 100 warm squares. At the tallest one, the car slowed beneath a broad overhang of stone and steel. Two guards stepped forward instantly, rain shining on their shoulders. One of them opened Margaret's door. She looked up at the tower, then at Julian. "Where exactly are we?" she asked. He offered his hand and waited until she took it before answering. somewhere people like to pretend they run the city. The lobby beyond the revolving doors was all marble floors and low amber light, the air cool enough to raise goosebumps on Margaret's arms. Every sound seemed softened by money. Heels on stone, the muted hiss of a fountain, the faint rattle of ice in crystal glasses from a lounge off to the side. People in tailored suits turned as Julian entered, and whatever conversation they had been having died instantly. Margaret felt those looks touch her before she even saw them clearly. Surprise, recognition, caution. Julian didn't slow. He guided her across the polished floor toward a private elevator set behind a wall of dark glass. Julian. A man called from the reception desk, his voice tight. The board is waiting. Julian stopped long enough to turn his head. Then they can keep waiting. The elevator doors opened soundlessly. Inside, the mirrors reflected Margaret's tired face, her hat pin, the damp hem of her skirt, and beside her Julian looked like a man carved from iron and candlelight. He pressed a key and the elevator began to rise. "This isn't a favor," he said at last, his reflection fixed on hers. "It's a decision." The car climbed in smooth silence, floor numbers lighting one by one above the door. Margaret's fingers tightened around the strap of her purse. She could feel, even without being told, that whatever waited on the top floor would not be about groceries anymore. Then the elevator slowed, and Julian's phone buzzed once in his hand. He looked down at the screen, read the message, and his jaw hardened. When the doors opened, a long corridor waited beyond, bright with white light and lined with closed doors. At the far end stood a woman in a red suit, perfectly still, holding a tablet against her chest. Julian stepped forward first, then stopped and glanced back at Margaret. "Before we go in," he said, "there's one thing you need to know." Margaret stepped into the corridor beside Julian, the polished floor reflecting the white overhead lights like a sheet of ice. The air smelled faintly of expensive cologne and printer toner, clean enough to feel almost sterile. The woman in the red suit clicked her tablet awake, the sound sharp in the quiet, and Julian held up one hand without looking away from Margaret. "Before we go in," he repeated, his voice low, "there's one thing you need to know." Margaret's fingers tightened around her purse strap. At the far end of the hall, behind the woman in red, a frosted glass door stood half open, and through it came the murmur of voices, the soft scrape of chairs, the low hum of a room full of people waiting for someone important to arrive. Julian's phone buzzed again. He checked it once, then slid it back into his pocket with a hard set to his jaw. "That man you helped," he said, glancing toward the door, "is not just some old stranger." The woman in red looked down at her tablet, then up at Margaret with a polite, unreadable smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Castellano is ready," she said. Julian's mouth tightened at the name. He stopped at the door, placing one hand on the brass handle, but he still didn't open it. Instead, he turned to Margaret and studied her face as if deciding how much truth she could carry in one breath. "The grocery store wasn't an accident," he said. The words landed softly, but they changed the air around them. Margaret looked from him to the woman in red, then back again. The overhead light caught on the silver in her hair, on the worn hem of her coat, on the paper grocery receipt still folded in her coat pocket. "What does that mean?" she asked. Julian exhaled through his nose, once, measured and controlled. He reached into his inner pocket and drew out a slim black wallet, not for money, but for identification. The card inside flashed gold for a second before he closed it again. "It means," he said, "the man you carried bags for this afternoon was my grandfather." Margaret's hand slipped from the purse strap. For a moment, the corridor seemed to narrow around the sound of the words. Somewhere behind the frosted glass, a chair leg scraped against the floor. The woman in red stepped aside, and the door opened wider, releasing a wash of warm light, the scent of leather and coffee, and the quiet authority of a room where no one raised their voice unless they expected obedience. Julian held the door, but did not go through. "He asked for you," he said. "After the store? After he heard how you were treated." Margaret took one slow step back, her shoes whispering against the marble. Julian watched that movement, then placed the black wallet back in his pocket and said, "If you walk in there, they'll all know who you are to him by the time you leave." He paused, letting the silence thicken. Then he added, "So before you decide anything, I need to know one thing." His gaze fixed on hers, steady and impossible to read. Are you ready to meet the man whose name this city says only in whispers? Margaret's hand tightened around the strap of her purse as Julian held the door open with 2 fingers, the black leather glove creasing softly against the brass handle. Inside, the private dining room glowed with amber light from low-wall sconces, and the polished oak table reflected the stems of untouched crystal glasses like thin blades of ice. She took 1 step inside, then another, the soles of her sensible shoes barely making a sound on the thick carpet. At the far end of the room sat the old man from the store, no longer hunched beneath fluorescent grocery lights, but seated straight-backed in a high-backed chair that looked carved for a king. His white hair caught the light, silver at the edges, and beside him stood a younger man in a dark suit with broad shoulders, sharp posture, and a face that made the room feel quieter just by existing in it. He did not smile. He simply watched Margaret enter, his gaze moving from her worn coat to the envelope still clutched in her hand, then to Julian, who nodded once and stepped back. "Mrs. Hayes," the old man said, his voice roughened by age but steady enough to carry through the room. "You came." Margaret stopped at the end of the table, the scent of roast coffee, polished wood, and expensive cologne hanging in the air. "I didn't know what I was walking into," she said carefully. The old man gave a slow nod, then lifted one hand and turned it slightly toward the man beside him. "This is my grandson, Adrian Vale." At that name, even the staff near the sideboard seemed to stiffen. Adrian did not move. He only looked at her with those unreadable eyes, the kind that measured everything and revealed nothing. Margaret glanced from one to the other, then set the envelope on the table with a soft slap that broke the stillness. "I brought your change," she said, "and the receipt from the pharmacist." The old man's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "You kept it?" "Of course I kept it." Her fingers smoothed the edge of the receipt, then tapped once against the folded paper inside the envelope. "You asked me to be there, so I was there." A waiter appeared silently with a silver tray and set down a glass of water, the ice clicking against the sides. Adrian's jaw shifted, just once. He reached into his jacket and placed Margaret's black wallet on the table, the same one she had thought lost at the store, its leather creased now from being carried close to his body. "You left this behind," he said. His voice was low, controlled, and stripped of anything unnecessary. Margaret stared at the wallet, then at him. "You had that this whole time?" "Since the parking lot." He waited a beat. "I saw what happened." The old man lowered his eyes to the table, and for a moment the room held only the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant clink of glass from somewhere beyond the door. Margaret reached for the wallet, but Adrian's hand covered it first, not to stop her, only to keep it steady. "At the store," he said, "you paid for what you thought was a stranger's groceries without hesitation." He looked at her then, directly. That kind of instinct is rare. Margaret let out a small breath through her nose and drew her hand back. "It was groceries," she said, "not a rescue mission." Adrian's mouth moved, almost a smile, but it didn't quite land. The old man leaned back, watching the exchange with a tired patience that seemed earned, not given. Then he slid a folded document across the table toward Margaret. The paper whispered over the wood and stopped in front of her fingers. "Open it," he said. Margaret hesitated, then unfolded it. Her eyes moved once across the page, then again, slower this time. The room didn't change, but something in her posture did as her hand tightened on the paper. Adrian noticed immediately. "What is it?" he asked. Margaret looked up at him, and for the first time, the certainty in his face gave way to something narrower. "It says," she said, holding the page in both hands, "that you're the one who owns the grocery chain my late husband worked for all those years." The words settled across the table like dropped silver. Adrian went still, the overhead light catching the hard line of his collar, while the old man closed his eyes for one brief second, as if bracing for the weight of what came next. Margaret kept the paper lifted between them, and when she spoke again, her voice was quiet enough to make everyone in the room lean in. "Which means you didn't bring me here just to return my wallet." Margaret lowered the page and set it carefully beside the untouched teacup, the porcelain making a soft click against the wood. Across from her, Adrian's jaw had gone rigid, the blue sleeve of his shirt catching the warm light from the chandelier as he leaned back in his chair. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the old man, his coat still smelling faintly of cedar and rain, reached for the cane resting beside his chair and pressed both hands over the worn handle. "I should have told you sooner," he said, his voice roughened by age and something deeper. "The store was never just a store. It was where I learned who kept this city moving." Margaret kept her gaze on him, and then on Adrian, whose polished cufflinks glinted like little knives under the amber light. "You didn't bring me here for my wallet," she said again, but this time the words had more weight behind them. Adrian exhaled slowly through his nose, the sound barely louder than the clink of ice melting in his glass. "No," he said. "I brought you here because the man who raised me used to talk about you." Margaret's fingers tightened around the edge of the tablecloth, feeling the stiff linen under her fingertips. The old man looked down at his hands. "Your late husband taught one of my foremen how to read invoices," he said. "And you were the woman who brought soup to the night crew every winter when nobody else cared if they had enough to eat." Margaret's lips parted, but before she could answer, Adrian pushed his chair back and stood. The movement was measured, controlled, the cuff of his dark suit brushing the polished armrest. He crossed the room in 2 steady steps, reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, and set a slim black card in front of her. "My grandfather told me what happened at the grocery store," he said. "He said you paid for his food without making him feel small. That doesn't happen much anymore." The room held the low hum of the refrigerator in the corner and the faint rain tapping against the tall windows. Margaret looked at the card, then at him. "I paid because he needed help," she said. "Not because I wanted thanks." Adrian's mouth shifted, almost into a smile, but it vanished before it could settle. "I know." He slid the card closer. "That's why I'm not offering you pity. I'm offering you a job." Margaret's brows lifted slightly. The old man turned his head, listening. Adrian kept his eyes on her, his voice even. "The chain is opening a community fund. No polished speeches. No fake charity dinners. I want someone who knows what real hardship looks like to run it. Someone who knows what it means to count every dollar and still show up with dignity." The chandelier above them threw gold over the table, and the steam from the untouched tea curled upward between them like a thin veil. Margaret did not touch the card yet. Instead, she looked at the old man. "And him?" she asked. The old man answered before Adrian could. "He stays under your rules," he said. "No cheating people. No squeezing the workers. No forgetting where the bread came from." Adrian gave a single nod, the kind that looked less like agreement and more like surrender. Then he reached into his jacket again and removed Margaret's grocery receipt, flattened now, the edges no longer crumpled. He placed it gently beside the card, as if returning more than paper. "Your payment at the store," he said, "covered more than groceries. It bought back a name this city should have never forgotten." Margaret's hand finally moved. She took the card, turned it once between her fingers, and slid it into her purse beside the old wallet he had returned to her. The leather gave a soft sigh as it closed. Outside, the rain eased against the glass, leaving the room wrapped in the quiet smell of tea, wet pavement, and expensive cologne. The old man rose with effort, and Adrian stepped in without hesitation to steady him. For the first time, Margaret saw no distance between them, only 3 people standing in the same light, with the same small table between them, and the same lesson sitting in plain sight. Adrian looked at her, then at his grandfather, and spoke with the calm certainty of a man sealing a promise. "From today on," he said, "no one in my world gets to be treated like they don't matter." Margaret picked up her teacup at last, and the room seemed to settle around that simple motion. "Good," she said, and took a slow sip. Then, with the rain fading against the windows and both men watching her with the kind of silence that belongs to respect, she set the cup down and said, "Because dignity should never need permission."